Imagine you are standing barefoot on a riverbank 750,000 years ago, your hands raw and stained green, grinding a fistful of wild acorns between two stones because your stomach has been empty since sunrise. Your fingers ache, the bitter dust of crushed nutshells stings the cracks in your skin, and the smell rising off the flat basalt slab in front of you is earthy, almost like wet soil after rain. This is not the caveman you were taught to picture. There is no spear in your hand. There is no fresh kill steaming over a fire. There is a rock, a plant, and hours of patient, boring work, because that work is what is going to keep you alive tonight. Here's a number that should stop you: 780,000. That is how many years ago archaeologists found the oldest direct evidence of humans processing plant food. Not eating it raw and moving on, but actually preparing it with tools, the same way you might prep a meal in your kitchen today. For decades, we were told a very different story. We were told that our ancestors were hunters first, that meat built the human brain, that our bodies are basically wired to crave red meat because that is what kept us alive on the savannah. This idea became so popular that an entire modern diet trend was built around it. Millions of people cutting out bread and rice and beans because they believed their Stone Age ancestors never touched them. But when scientists actually started digging, literally digging, into the archaeological record instead of the assumptions, they found something the meat-heavy story conveniently ignored. So why did we get this so wrong for so long? Part of the answer is almost embarrassingly simple. Bones survive, plants do not. When archaeologists excavate an ancient campsite, they tend to find piles of animal bones, because bone is hard and mineral-rich and can last hundreds of thousands of years in the right soil. A wild yam, a handful of berries, a fistful of ground seeds, all of that rots away within a few seasons and leaves almost nothing behind. So for most of the 20th century, researchers built their picture of ancient diets out of the only evidence that had physically survived, and that evidence was mostly bones. It is a little like trying to understand what someone ate over an entire lifetime by only looking at the trash they left in one single bin, the one that happens to be waterproof, while every other bin quietly dissolved. That bias shaped an entire narrative, and that narrative became culture. It became fitness magazines. It became grocery store marketing. It became the mental image most of us still carry of a caveman gnawing on a mammoth leg. But here is where things get genuinely strange. In 2025, researchers led by Hadar Ahitov at the Zinman Institute of Archaeology at the University of Haifa, working with a team from Bar Ilan University, published findings in the journal PNAS about a site called Gesher Banot Yaakov on the banks of the Jordan River in northern Israel. They were not looking at bones this time. They were looking at basalt stones, hammerstones, and anvils, tools that had been used for cracking and crushing something. Under a microscope, they found starch grains preserved directly on the surface of those tools. Grains from acorns, from wild cereals, from legumes, even from aquatic plants like yellow water lilies and an extinct species of water chestnut. These starch grains were 780,000 years old, making them the oldest direct evidence ever found of humans deliberately processing plant foods, not gathering plants by accident, processing them, selecting them, preparing them with the same intention you would use choosing and cooking ingredients for dinner tonight. And this was not an isolated case. This is where the story escalates, because the deeper researchers dug, the more this pattern repeated itself on completely different continents. Around 2024, a team led by Jennifer Chen at Penn State, working with archaeologist Randy Haas, examined 24 sets of human remains from the Andean highlands of Peru, dating to between 9,000 and 6,500 years ago, using a technique called stable isotope analysis, essentially chemically reading what elements are locked into ancient bone based on a lifetime of eating. They discovered something that upended the standard hunter-gatherer narrative for that region entirely. 80% of these ancient people's diet was plant matter, mostly wild tubers like early potatoes. Only 20% came from meat. Think about that using something you already understand. A simple village of 10 people. If this data were spread evenly across that village, 8 of those 10 people would be eating almost entirely plants, while only 2 would regularly be eating meat, and even those 2 would still be eating plants most days too. That is not a footnote to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. That is the main course, with hunting as the side dish. But is this a fluke of one region, one river valley, one mountain range? That is the obvious next question, and researchers asked it too. So they looked elsewhere, at a cave called Tafaralt in Morocco. A study published in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution found further evidence of a plant-heavy diet among prehistoric foragers, with an added twist that reverses the causation we usually assume. We tend to think agriculture came first, and settled, plant-based living came after, almost as a downstream effect of farming. But the Tafaralt evidence suggests something closer to the opposite sequence. A heavily plant-based diet allowed mothers to wean infants earlier, because plant foods are easier to prepare for a young child than tough animal protein. Earlier weaning meant shorter gaps between births. Shorter gaps between births meant faster population growth. In other words, eating more plants may not have simply followed the shift towards settled life. It may have helped cause it, quietly setting the stage for agriculture long before anyone ever planted a seed on purpose. And then there is the detail that makes this whole picture even more remarkable, because eating a wild plant is nowhere near as simple as picking a berry off a bush. A team including archaeologist Anna Florin at the Australian National University, working with colleagues at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, documented evidence that humans were grinding wild seeds, pounding starchy tubers, and detoxifying bitter, sometimes mildly poisonous nuts as far back as 170,000 years ago. This required knowledge passed down across generations, knowing which plants needed to be soaked, which needed to be ground, which needed careful preparation before they were safe to eat at all. This is not the image of a lucky forager stumbling onto an easy meal. This is closer to an inherited culinary science, technical, patient, and remarkably sophisticated for a species usually caricatured as simple-minded and violent. It is worth pausing here, because none of this means life was easy, or that there is some idyllic, better version of humanity we lost along the way. This work was hard. Hours of grinding could yield a modest meal. Detoxifying certain plants incorrectly could make you sick, or worse. There was no guarantee of success, no supermarket backup plan if a harvest failed. The honest picture is not one of paradise. It is one of skill under real, constant pressure. And this pattern was not unique to humans either, which makes the story even more interesting when you place it next to our closest living relatives. Chimpanzees, who share the vast majority of our genetic code, spend the overwhelming majority of their feeding time on fruit, leaves, and other plant material, with meat making up only an occasional opportunistic part of their diet. If our nearest animal relatives lean so heavily plant-based, and if the deepest archaeological evidence we have also points toward plants, then the meat-obsessed caveman was never really biology. It was branding. There's a modern echo running through almost every part of this story too, because right now, in your own kitchen, if you have ever soaked dried beans overnight, or ground grain into flour, or learned which mushrooms are safe and which are not, you are performing a distant, softened version of exactly what that person on the riverbank was doing 780,000 years ago. The tools have changed completely. The blender has replaced the basalt stone, but the underlying human behavior, transforming a difficult plant into something nourishing through skill and patience, has barely changed at all. And here's perhaps the strangest twist of all. The one that reframes everything you thought you knew. Walking into this, every human culture ever documented without a single known exception developed some method of processing plant food before eating it. Whether that meant grinding, soaking, fermenting, or cooking, no human society anywhere on Earth at any point in the archaeological record has ever simply eaten wild plants raw and unprepared as its main food source, the way you might imagine an animal grazing in a field. That universal, unbroken pattern is not an accident. It suggests that this kind of careful, intelligent food preparation is not some modern convenience layered on top of a simpler biological past. It may be one of the oldest, most defining threads of what makes us human at all, older than agriculture, older than cities, older than almost anything else we usually point to when we try to explain ourselves. So the next time you picture a caveman, maybe let go of the spear and the roaring fire for a second, and picture instead a person crouched by a river, grinding a handful of bitter seeds into something edible, patiently, carefully, generation after generation, quietly building the very foundation the rest of human history would eventually stand on.